All right, so today we're going to talk about everyday memory. I kind of like calling it reconstructive memory. You can almost call this lecture series reconstructive memory, though I would say that's a little misleading because it's not just reconstructive, it's also reproductive to some extent. And you might be asking, what does that mean? Well, reproductive means that the memory is stored and is relatively intact and recall is simply about retrieving the stored memory, whereas reconstructive memory means that the memory is rebuilt using bits of the memory, but also existing knowledge and expectations. You can kind of think of reproductive memory as like playing back a recording of a movie, whereas reconstructive memory is like writing a movie script from scattered notes. Okay. So here's sort of a quick outline of what we're going to talk about. As with most lectures, this class can kind of be thought of as, how is human cognition different from computers? So we'll talk about the story, we'll talk about how memory was thought to be in line with how computers stored memories, and then we're going to talk about why that's wrong. We'll also talk about the importance of meaning and schemas in memory. And on that point, we'll talk about that point or that part of the lecture will be sort of talking about what memory is really all about. And hopefully that'll come across well. We'll also talk about how schemas can not only hurt your memory, right? Hurt our memory accuracy, make or lead us to make memory errors, but it can also help us reconstruct memories, right? So it has benefits and costs. Our reconstructive memory has a certain amount of benefits and costs, and we'll get to this. And then we'll talk about misinformation effects, and then we'll talk about levels of processing hypothesis. I'll just skip these for now, and we'll talk about them when we get there. Okay, so again, remember the computational theory of mind says that the mind is literally a computer, not like a silicon computer, but it's an information processing computer. And so it has hardware. And just like how a computer has its own hardware and its own software, the mind has uh, is like the software, and the brain is like the hardware. And this was the dominant view for quite a while. And this brings up the idea that memory is like a storage place, right? Or the memory as a storehouse metaphor. And the idea was that memories are nested in a series of storage areas. So this could be file drawers, or just some sort of space. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be file drawer, sorry, uh, filing cabinets, right? Or file drawers. It could be shelves or something like that. It's just a metaphor, right? But the important thing is that they're like spaces, right? Our memories are located somewhere, right? So, for example, memory for your 16th birthday may be filed away in your teenage storage locker within a specific file, which is itself nested inside of a specific filing cabinet, right? And viewed in this way. And the task, according to this view, right, the task was mainly to determine the structure of the filing system and how things got filed, right? Now, again, it's not like it doesn't have to be a filing cabinet. It could be a filing cabinet or shelves or just free floating locations. The point was that according to this framework, memories were stable objects in stable locations. And so by this framework, memories were recorded and stored away in some sort of nested space. And then what you would do is retrieve them by searching the files and bringing them into conscious awareness. And it's a pretty simplistic way of thinking about memory, but it's not bad. It's certainly a reasonable way of thinking about it, at least as a starting point. Yeah, I already said that. And yes, and then there's the things that I said. Sorry. Um, so one thing to keep in mind is that computers separate storage from processing. So information is stored on a physical device, such as a solid state drive or a hard drive. That storage device holds the data even when the computer is turned off, When the computer needs to use that information, it doesn't process it directly from the solid state drive. Instead, the operating system copies the needed data into RAM, or random access memory, which is much faster. The central processing unit then performs computations using the information in RAM. So in a computer, storage and processing are handled by different components with different jobs. The solid state drive is primarily for long-term storage. RAM is, or random access memory is temporary working memory, and the CPU performs the computations. So the separation between storage and processing is one reason uh, is basically how researchers thought about memory, right? Uh, about human memory, and so that's why I put this little wall here to show that there's a physical separation between the storage function, and the physical function, right? So similarly, the memory store metaphor thought of processing as being separate from memory. And this is probably inaccurate, if not an incomplete conceptualization of how the mind works. So the other implication of this conceptualization of memory as a storehouse is that memory is relatively reproductive. So you encode the information, you store it, and then you retrieve it when you need it. But the important thing is that you're reproducing it in a faithful manner. Um, you're literally getting the actual memory event and sort of just regurgitating it out. The problem is that this doesn't seem to be how memory works. So here's an example of a very famous study that was done by Carmichael et al., 1932. And in this study, participants basically saw an ambiguous drawing. So the ambiguous drawings are here in the middle column that says original stimuli. So for example, this one right here is a horizontal line with two circles on each side, right? And participants are shown this object and then asked to reproduce it later from memory. But here's the kicker, right? Sometimes they would see one kind of label like eyeglasses next to it, and sometimes they would see a different label like dumbbells. And they found that participants reconstructed the image in a way that was consistent with the verbal label. So people who saw dumbbells next to the picture reproduced a dumbbell, whereas, or something that looked more like a dumbbell, whereas people who saw the eyeglasses label next to the drawing were more likely to draw something that looked like eyeglasses, right? And so it appears that participants were meaningfully integrating the label with the image and then recalling not what they saw, but the meaning of what they saw, right? So how did they interpret that drawing, that original stimulus? And this shows that we don't simply reproduce information in our memory, but we also reconstruct our memory based on partial information or other sorts of extraneous information. It also shows that our memory system tries to extract meaning from the world and remember not what we experience, but the meaning of what we experience. And so it also, let's see, uh, so it's not simply that we're storing information that our retinas receive, but we're storing what the image meant to us. Um, yeah, so it's not what you're seeing that gets stored, it's what it means to us that gets stored. Okay. And so this shows that memory is not as stable as we think, and it really shows that memory is both reconstructive and it's more reconstructive and less reproductive than we probably would like to think. In a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways, this is good, right? There are benefits to this. The benefits are that we can actually remember a lot more than we probably would otherwise. And it also means that we're good at extracting meaning and remembering details that are important to us. But it's bad in that sometimes we can make errors or we don't faithfully reproduce the memory in question, right? We don't remember the little minutia details of the memory. Okay. And then the other thing about memory is that it's quite malleable and susceptible to misinformation. And we'll talk about this a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about this first part, which we'll talk about in the next video.